What's up, guys? Before we begin, I'm gonna say this. In terms of story, Red Dead Redemption 2 can't even hold a candle to Red Dead Redemption 1. They shouldn't even be compared in the same sentence.
¡Déjenme, hombre!
¡Mierda! ¡Ay, Dios mío! ¡Puta Santa María!
So you want to settle this now, friend? Or you want me to shoot you in the head right now for that poor girl?
But in terms of world building, Red Dead Redemption 2 is without equal. It's by far the best world ever put into a video game. And that's not just because the animals are fully simulated. You can hunt, you can fish, you can follow every road and rob every shop, but because Rockstar did one of the most important things possible when world building. They hewed closely to history. And so, even though the game isn't technically historical, because of the painstaking amount of research they've done, there are hundreds of historical facts to be learned. But for now, I'm gonna give you 10. Without further ado, let's begin. "50 historical facts from Red Dead Redemption 2. Number 1. Tintype. When you start a new game in Red Dead Redemption 2, what's the first thing you see? No, not this. The first thing you see. The loading screen. You can't tell me you're a history buff if you don't pop at least a little history boner when you see these awesome tintypes. It was the premier photo capturing technique of the age. Invented in 1853, it used cheap chemicals to burn a picture onto a metal plate. It was quick, reliable, and didn't require a lot of equipment, so it could be stored and carried through rough, dangerous conditions. Some of the finest photos of the Civil War are tintypes, and it was the prime choice of wildlife photographers and amateurs. And so, even though it was supplanted in the East by better looking, more expensive techniques, it reigned supreme in the Wild West, where it's better to take a bad picture and live than a good picture and die.
Wait. Oh! Ah! Damn!
Number 2 and 3. Canning and medical wonders. The 19th century was a century of inventions. There were hundreds of them, which literally changed the world as we know it. But there are none besides steam power, which would be more influential than the can. Arthur Morgan and the gang take them for granted, even though they were invented in their modern state just 50 years before. The first cans were invented by order of Napoleon early in the Napoleonic Wars, but they were practically useless. They were optimized later in the 1820s, but were expensive and notoriously sealed with lead. It wouldn't be until the first modern wars, the Crimean War and the Civil War, that the modern can and the techniques to mass produce them were developed. So from the 1860s onward, you didn't have to spend hours at the market every day just to eat. This made city living easier and more convenient. And of course, when city living is made easier, so turn the wheels of progress. But even with the more modern food storage and transportation technologies, the Red Dead games still sit well within the dark age of medical science. The age when the best prescription for disease was food and rest, or opiates and cocaine. The true miracle cure, antibiotics, was still 30 years away. And yet that didn't stop quack scientists and doctors from selling false miracle cures of their own. But in the Red Dead Redemption games, these cures actually work and help the player. This is probably the only place where Red Dead Revolver is more realistic, because in that game, it's a poisonous projectile that stuns enemies. And that's the truth. Health cures would have been no more than random herbs mixed with water. And the more famous snake oil was just snake parts mixed with herbs and water, based on Chinese snake oil brought over by Chinese immigrants. These false cures ran rampant in the 19th century, until the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 finally stamped them out, making snake oil salesmen outlaws. Number 4. Train robberies. Train robbing is as American as the burger, because it's only really possible in places where there are great swaths of frontier. In the protected depots of cities, they're impossible to hit, but out on the open range, it's child's play. In the real world, people tend to value their lives a little more than in video games, and so they usually surrendered without a fight, and even opened the safe. The art form was perfected during the Civil War, when it was a literal military strategy to hit trains and blow tracks, thereby disrupting the supply lines of enemy armies. After the war, these techniques were handed down to Southern guerrillas, who refused to accept their defeat, and from them to outlaws, who as law grew in the East, carried their art to the West, well into the 1900s. Number 5. Bonds. One of the worst things these outlaws could have found when they opened the safe, and what the Dutch Vanderlyn gang find when they hit the Cornwall train, was a stack of bonds instead of cash. Bonds are essentially an IOU from the government to be paid at a later date, given to Leviticus Cornwall to develop the region out of his own pocket, to then redeem the bonds for his losses and then some. They were first established during the American Revolution to be used during times of economic stress, and because of this, the debt was commonly defaulted on by the government. It would have been impossible for the Vanderlyn gang to sell them as they claimed to do. America has a history of dodging debts, and so when it hears that outlaws have stolen the bonds, it'd be happy to void them and clear its debt.
Paper! Paper!
Number 6. Pinkertons. Long before the foundation of government agencies like the CIA and the FBI, protection of the government's internal interests fell to private security agencies. And none of these agencies was more influential and powerful than the Pinkertons. Alan Pinkerton, its founder, made his name when in 1861 he foiled an assassination plot against the president-elect Abraham Lincoln. From there, the young Pinkerton agency was given more and more power in government. It was contracted to protect the president and his family, and thus was the direct precursor to the Secret Service. And Alan Pinkerton and his hand-picked agents spied on the Confederates throughout the Civil War. Alan Pinkerton's life was pretty incredible, actually. I can't really get into it here, but I strongly recommend you research him yourself. The guy needs a movie made out of his life. After the Civil War, the Pinkertons reached the height of their prestige as they swelled their ranks and spread across America. When they weren't working for the government, they were protecting the interests of railroad tycoons and investigating train robberies. This made them a thorn in the side of some of the greatest outlaws of the age, Butch Cassidy and Jesse James, which by extension made them a part of the legend of the Wild West. I'm happy Rockstar put them in the Red Dead Redemption games, though in Red Dead 2 they're so stupid, I'm sure Alan Pinkerton drilled through his grave. In reality, the Pinkertons were smart and effective. A little too effective. By the 1890s, there were more Pinkertons than soldiers in the US Army. And because they were a private organization, they could be hired by anyone to break Union strikes and, notoriously, stop Caribbean slave revolts. It was clear that after Alan Pinkerton's death in 1884, their moral code had fallen. They were essentially mercenaries, hired by the government as well-dressed thugs. Realizing this, The government passed the Anti-Pinkerton Act in 1893 to curb their monopoly, but it wouldn't be until the formation of government agencies to take their place, like the FBI in 1908, that the Pinkertons would finally fade away into obscurity. Number 7 and 8, Southern Guerillas and Moonshine. For many Southern Americans, the loss of the Civil War was a hard pill to swallow, and even after peace was made, many refused to put down their arms. Like I said, they robbed trains, wreaked havoc, and particularly targeted African Americans. The Lemoyne Raiders are one such gang, a band of white supremacist ex-Confederates who use military precision and fear tactics to rule Lemoyne. And with Lemoyne basically being Louisiana, it's no coincidence that Rockstar put them here, because Louisiana was home to some of the most prolific Southern guerrilla bands of the Reconstruction: the White League, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Ku Klux Klan. One of the main sources of income for the Lemoyne Raiders, apart from robbery, is the age-old American tradition of moonshining. Originally conceived in the early to mid-1800s to dodge alcohol tax, it was mostly confined to backwaters like the Rockies or the Bayou, until it exploded in the late 1800s to early 1900s, the age of the Red Dead Redemption games, thanks to a new Christian movement that was sweeping the nation: Prohibition. Closely tied to women's suffrage, in that drunk men tend to beat their wives and neglect their children, it became frowned upon to drink, and the never-before-heard idea that God himself despised drunkards began to spread. Because of this, more and more towns banned alcohol, calling themselves dry, and as the number of dry towns grew, more and more moonshine distilleries popped up to fill the demand. As Prohibition drew closer and closer, these bootleggers, as they were called, realized the amount of money they made from selling illegal alcohol dwarfed every other criminal enterprise. In fact, it was the huge amount of money they made from bootlegging that would sow the early seeds of the Mafia. Number 9. Life in a Victorian City. Man, Saint Denis is great. It's probably the greatest city ever put in a video game. It's so well researched and well presented. When you first enter Saint Denis in Chapter 4, you're smothered by the smog, shocked by the pollution, and stunned by the sound. The Victorian age was an age of invention, yes, but little thought was actually put into how these inventions would affect the people around them. Because the Victorian city was filthy. Filthier than nature in most cases. Grime coated the streets. Smoke from the factories clung to your clothes, and the tightly packed populations meant disease and vermin ran rampant. It's safe to say that if you were a low-class city dweller, the 19th century was probably one of the worst times to be alive. And Rockstar does a great job of showing this. You feel dirty when you're in Saint Denis, and you can clearly see the class divide between the frock-coated, wine-swilling wealthy and the soot-covered, depressed working class. But this is still Rockstar's version of 1800s New Orleans. Likely because of the need for flavor and a lack of space, they can't show the sheer amount of poverty that existed in the city. Of course, there's plenty of it, but compared to Victorian New Orleans, Saint Denis is a utopia. There are more Spanish and French colonial buildings, art museums, and jazz and vaudeville theaters than massive slums and open sewers. At that time, New Orleans was the third greatest city in America, and in the Victorian era, that was classified by how many men could work on the docks and in the factories, not by how well they lived. Number 10. The First Mafia. One of the most badass things in Saint Denis, which completely surprised me when I first played the game, was the godfather Angelo Bronte and his Sicilian Mafia. Because Rockstar really showed their work. While New York City and Chicago are synonymous with the Mafia today, people tend to forget that it was in New Orleans where the first Mafia was born. After the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, those aforementioned white power groups took a stranglehold over Louisiana. In an effort to keep freed slaves on the fields, they scared them out of the factories and off the docks. And so, in order to fill the massive demand for workers, they chose the lesser of two evils and hired immigrants, mostly Sicilians. In the 1880s, 1 in every 4 immigrants to America was Sicilian, because after the unification of Italy in the 1870s, Sicily got the shit end of the stick. They were taxed brutally, and very little of the money went back into their infrastructure, so it was basically medieval. Sicilians were used to being considered a lesser race, so when they immigrated to America and found that there was a lower man on the totem pole, they thrived. By the 1880s to 90s, the docks and factories of New Orleans were filled with Sicilians, and with more and more coming in every day, the less morally conscious formed gangs. And with wave after wave of new recruits coming in, they were basically able to bully and extort instead of work. They mostly targeted their own countrymen, and with there being so many of them, they were able to take full control over the working class districts of the city. And because the government of Louisiana was so laser focused on African Americans, they turned a blind eye, taking bribes and allowing the Sicilians to basically become the de facto rulers of New Orleans. And so, with the knowledge that Angelo Bronte made his fortune skimming from the paychecks of hard-working Sicilian immigrants, it was that much easier to watch him die. That's all, folks. But it doesn't just stop at 10. I'll be back with more facts sometime next week. See you then.